Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to the New Books Network. This is a special series on Malcolm X and Black nationalism. In this series, we delve into the background of Malcolm X's action and thought in the context of Black nationalism, correcting the fundamentally mistaken notion that Malcolm X was a civil rights leader. He certainly did not see himself in that way, and explicitly argued otherwise. This helps us place the Afro-American struggle in its dimensions beyond the current American nation-state, including the Black Atlantic and beyond. Today, our guest is Saladin Malik Ambar, author of Malcolm X at Oxford Union, Racial Politics in a Global Era, published in 2013 by Oxford University Press. Welcome, Saladin.
Hey, Kirk. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Great. It's a real pleasure. So I'm joining you at one part of the Black Atlantic here in Trinidad, and you are joining us from where?
From Allentown, Pennsylvania.
Right. Good. Can you? We like to start off our podcast normally by asking the authors to just give us a little bit of a background to yourself in relation to the subject of your book.
Sure. Well, I grew up in New York City, in Queens, during the 1970s and 80s, and there was still quite a bit of influence of the Nation of Islam, of Malcolm X's teachings. There were old cassette tapes available in Harlem. My cousin and I, he really introduced me to Malcolm X when I was growing up. We would go to the Mart on 125th Street in Harlem to pick up some of the old albums and cassettes that were available of Malcolm X. We would go to the Liberation Bookstore in Harlem, sometimes on weekends, and buy a lot of books on Black history and certainly some of the speeches and writings of Malcolm X. So, in the 80s in New York, there was a great deal of racial violence and tension related to police brutality and lots of episodes that were, deeply troubling. And, as a young man who was seeking his own sense of identity, like so many others at that time, I gravitated towards Malcolm X as this prolific figure who could speak to my experience, even though he had been deceased for, 20, 25 years when I was coming into my youth,
Yeah, and you mentioned the 1980s in New York. Was hip hop and Public Enemy a big part of that? I know it was for me.
Yeah, without question. In fact, I was a 5%er, like so many rappers and hip hop guys.
Eric B. and Rakim were 5%ers, weren't they?
That's right. They certainly were. And Nas and that whole world was just a powerful scene for racial identity and indeed Black nationalism and Islam and so forth. So, without question, I gravitated towards Malcolm's teachings and to be honest, there was, this was the time, I don't know if any of your listeners will know, but they could look it up, events at Howard Beach and in Bensonhurst, and a lot of rappers, hip hop artists were speaking to, the racial crimes and hatred towards Black folk that were occurring at that time. And so hip hop was definitely a part of the consciousness raising of Black youth and others, but certainly Black youth during that time.
Yeah, and this would have been before the Spike Lee movie. So Malcolm was still, I actually grew up in Toronto, so not too far away from New York, but still a different country and context. And Malcolm X still was a kind of almost an outlaw figure in the early to mid 80s. Spike Lee did a lot to, I guess, bring him into the mainstream acceptability in a lot of ways. But yeah, I remember getting those sort of tapes and cassettes, and it was like dealing in real underground kind of things. I don't know if it was different in New York at the time, if it was more open or what.
No, you had to go to, typically Harlem or maybe Brooklyn. There was some, really great bookstores, Nkiru Books in Brooklyn was one. There were a number of them, but they certainly they were not at your local Barnes and Noble. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That you had to or Tower Records, which was big at the time. You had to go offline and typically go to the Black community bookstores and marts to get those tapes. And I remember there was an album, literally a record album of Message to the Grassroots, and Malcolm was
I remember that
on the cover. It was sort of stylized version of him on the cover. And we would listen to that record, and again, lots of tapes. And one other thing I will say, there was a great television series in New York on Sundays on ABC, hosted by Gil Noble, called Like It Is.
Okay.
And we would rush, if we were playing stickball or basketball or whatever we were doing, you'd rush home to be there by 1:00, maybe 12:30, whatever the time it was. And Gil Noble often had, old interviews with Malcolm X. He would often play clips of him. And, if you could get a little bite-sized view of Malcolm X, man, that was golden. That was awesome.
Oh, yeah. That's what's so amazing about like the Public Enemy album, like Takes a Nation of Millions, like with all the little excerpts from Farrakhan and Malcolm. It's like, wow.
That's right.
Yeah, amazing. And it's so your name, Saladin, that's not your birth name, is it?
No, I was born to an Italian-American mother of Sicilian ancestry. As a matter of fact, I'm in the process of becoming an Italian citizen right now.
Oh, wow.
Dual citizenship. So no, my given name, I was named for my father, Ralph Lamb, and a rather less melodic name than Saladin Malik Ambar. But Malik Ambar was actually a name I chose out of a book, World's Great Men of Color, by J.A. Rogers. That was one of the books that we, really were empowered by, because it had all these great, historical set pieces of figures, from antiquity and other and later periods. And Malik Ambar was an Ethiopian slave who had been brought to India and became a Mughal dynasty ruler, and it was right. Mm-hmm. And Saladin was just a name that I chose, kind of an attribute of Allah at the time, and also in part inspired by a guy who I didn't know very well, but my uncle knew, named Saladin, who is a magnificent brother, very tall, powerful, and well-spoken guy who I think I kind of admired from afar. So that had a good deal to do with it. So there was a lot of this, name adopting, style adopting of Malcolm, in New York, and I imagine other places, certainly in the North, in the United States. And so we were, proud adherents to a lot of his teachings, and really a lot of his attitude towards what it meant to be growing up in America as a Black person.
Right. Were you, just out of curiosity, were you a member of the 5 Percenters at that time? Was that like, how in the Nation of Islam you have the X? Is that at all part of being a 5 Percenter?
It was. In fact, I guess, my 5 Percenter name was Saladin Allah. Okay. But I ultimately gravitated towards a more conventional Islam, as I sort of grew into the faith at that time. But, I remember, I went to parliaments in New York City, which were, sort of monthly Sunday gatherings of 5 Percenters from around New York. It was inspiring to be around, we're talking 14, 15, 16-year-old, some older, of course, but, Black kids who were reading a ridiculous amount of history and science and studying mathematics, and had a very unique way of viewing the world and their Blackness, and it was deeply empowering, to be on that journey at the time. So yeah, I was part of that of that period in New York. That was a very important time in my life, a kind of major period of self-awakening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I too was inspired by that, and I'm not African American. I mean, I'm of Indian descent, but although from the Caribbean, so there's a lot of I mean, so my heritage is also Caribbean, and that involves the wider Afro-American struggle, defined as the whole hemisphere of the Americas. Definitely, that's part of my history as well. But I totally understand that. Just one final thing on your little personal background, but I think it's so important for our discussion. Do the Right Thing came out at that time, around that time, Spike Lee, and you being half Italian, half Sicilian, how did you respond to that movie?
It's interesting. I think, I came to really appreciate and value and honor, I guess, my Italian/Sicilian ancestry later in life, as a kid who grew up Black in New York. And really, it was a period in time where, people weren't walking around considering themselves biracial, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, that became a later phenomenon, the one drop rule very much applied.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I was still really seeking, for a variety of reasons, but still seeking a kind of personal identity. Also, I think, masculine and male figures and images to look up to. My cousin and my uncle, I had some very important, and my other Uncle John on my mom's side, but certainly my Uncle Michael and David on my father's side were instrumental figures in, me pursuing not only a sense of personal identity, but a sense of, belonging to a history that, I really didn't know. I went to predominantly white schools in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was blown away by the lack and dearth of information about Africa and so on. So, I had to cobble together an understanding of my Blackness over time. And so I became, a voracious reader at an early age.
Yeah, I totally identify with that. And yeah, that point you mentioned, we can expand on that as we proceed through the discussion. But about identity, I think that a lot of people who don't understand the power of Malcolm X. I mean, how he transforms, especially young men's lives entirely. My whole life changed because of Malcolm X. That's why I live in Trinidad and no longer up in Toronto, where the rest of my family live, and they thought I was crazy because I left. But I couldn't live there anymore. I mean, the whole sense of an identity, both, as you mentioned, masculine, being a man, and also racial, ancestral identity as well. This sense of belonging, of history, of the alienation from the environment which you're in. I think a lot of people don't understand the depth of that alienation that exists, for essentially non-white people. That's what it is, and African Americans in particular have a deep, long history of that. I come from an immigrant family up there, so it's not the same, and I totally recognize it's not the same as the African American experience. The descendant of slaves. I think that's very, very important to differentiate and to acknowledge. Hello. If you enjoyed this clip, why not listen to the whole interview at newbooksnetwork.com, or you can check on the link in the description below. At newbooksnetwork.com, just search for Kirk Megu and you'll see all my interviews, including this one, in the topics of politics and polemics, and my special series on Malcolm X and Black nationalism, and also third world nationalism. So check that out and let me know what you think. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel here and also subscribe on the New Books Network. Okay, take care. Bye.